On the snow-covered plains of Yellowstone National Park live the most genetically intact bison left on Earth. Scientists have called them the purest wild bison in existence. 99.7% untouched by the cattle ranching that reshaped almost every other herd on the continent, the crown jewel of American conservation. That is what everyone believed, right up until the spring of 2022, when a team of geneticists ran a single test on those exact animals. They expected the test to confirm what the whole field already knew. Instead, what it found quietly rewrote the genetic history of an entire species. And every part of it traces back to 23 animals that, by any reasonable measure, should never have survived at all. I'm Graham Whitmore, and this is the full story of how America came within a hair of losing the bison forever, how it was dragged back from that edge by a handful of people history barely remembers, and what a DNA test run 120 years later discovered hiding in plain sight inside the most protected herd in North America. To understand how impossible that survival really was, you have to go back to when this animal still owned the continent. Great Plains, 1873. A single herd stretches farther than the human eye can follow, a dark river of bodies moving across grassland that runs unbroken to the horizon. Somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison once covered North America. They were not just present on the landscape, they built it. Their hooves broke and turned the soil. Their grazing decided which plants lived and which died. Entire nations of people shaped their economies, their food, and their faith around the rhythm of the herds. And then, in the space of a single human lifetime, almost all of it was gone. It did not happen slowly, and it did not happen by accident. The destruction of the American bison is one of the fastest large animal collapses ever recorded. Commercial outfits stripped hides by the millions and shipped them east by the rail car. Passengers fired rifles out of moving train windows for sport and left the bodies to rot where they fell. And military leaders understood exactly what they were doing when they let the slaughter run, because wiping out the herds meant breaking the plains tribes who depended on them for everything. By the late 1880s, the math had become almost unbelievable, from tens of millions of animals down to a few hundred. One careful survey at the time put the number of wild bison left alive in the entire United States at 541. 541 animals left to carry a species that had once darkened the horizon from Texas to Canada. Here is the part that matters more than any other number in this story. Every bison alive today, all roughly 500,000 of them, traces back to that tiny remnant. The entire genetic future of the species got squeezed down into a few hundred survivors, and whatever those survivors happen to be carrying in their blood is exactly what the future would inherit. No more and no less. Hold on to that thought, because it is the key that unlocks everything else in this video. And the most isolated of those survivors were hiding high in the mountains of Yellowstone. Even there, they were not safe. By 1902, poachers were slipping into the park's backcountry and shooting the last wild bison for their heads alone, which sold to private collectors for more money than most working men earned in a year. When rangers finally took a hard count of what remained in the park's central valleys, they landed on a number that stopped them cold: roughly 23. 23 animals, the last of a population that had grazed those high valleys for thousands of years, now small enough to stand together inside a single fenced pasture, and the men running the park understood immediately what that number meant. A herd that small does not just risk being shot out of existence, it risks collapsing quietly from the inside as inbreeding hollows out the bloodline generation by generation until the line simply stops. They needed fresh bison, and they needed them fast. So in 1902, Yellowstone made a decision that would define the species for the next 120 years. It would rebuild its herd by bringing in outside bison to breed with the 23 survivors. There was just one problem with that plan. By 1902, almost nowhere else on the continent had any bison left to give. One man had already seen this coming, years before anyone else was willing to look. In 1886, a Smithsonian taxidermist named William Temple Hornaday traveled west to collect bison specimens for the museum on the simple assumption that the species would soon be extinct and was worth preserving behind glass. What he found in the field horrified him. The herds he had been sent to sample were already almost gone. Hornaday came home a changed man, and the taxidermist who had set out to mount dead bison spent the rest of his life trying to save the living ones instead. He helped found the American Bison Society in 1905, and he recruited a genuinely powerful ally to serve as its honorary president, a sitting United States president named Theodore Roosevelt. Together, they pushed for protected land and federal herds, and in 1908, Roosevelt established the National Bison Range on tribal land in Montana. The warning had finally been heard at the highest levels of government, but saving a species on paper is one thing. Finding actual breathing animals to rebuild it with is another. And for that, the conservationists who had just been handed federal backing had to turn to a small group of people who had been quietly doing the real work all along, with no government help and no recognition. This is the part of the rescue that almost never makes it into the textbooks. The bison did not owe its survival, first and foremost, to Washington. The earliest rescue came from native and frontier families who acted while the official world was still looking the other way. In 1873, a Pandoré man remembered today as Walking Coyote crossed the Continental Divide with a small group of orphaned bison calves, their mothers killed in a hunt out on the plains. With nowhere else to go, the calves had followed the hunter's horses for safety, which is exactly what made them easy to gather. He carried somewhere between 4 and 7 of them home to the Flathead Valley. By 1884, that handful had grown into a herd of around 13, and he sold those animals to 2 ranchers of mixed native and European heritage, Michel Pablo and Charles Allard, who turned them loose across the grasslands of the Flathead Reservation. The herd kept growing from there. In 1893, Pablo and Allard expanded it further by buying dozens more bison from a famous frontier rancher named Buffalo Jones, a mix of purebred animals and a number of known cattle hybrids. By the end of the century, the Pablo Allard herd had become the largest herd of plains bison anywhere on Earth. Far to the south in the Texas Panhandle, a rancher named Charles Goodnight had built a herd of his own, started from a handful of survivors his wife had urged him to protect. Between the 2 operations, these private citizens, working with no funding and no instructions from anyone, were quietly holding a meaningful share of the entire species inside their own pastures. None of them had any idea that buried somewhere in those bloodlines was a detail that would not surface for another 120 years. These were the people Yellowstone eventually turned to. In 1902, the park bought 21 bison from these private herds. 18 cows came from the Pablo Allard stock in Montana. 3 bulls came from Goodnight's herd in Texas. They were shipped in by rail and raised at a working ranch inside the park in a wide sweep of grassland called the Lamar Valley. The plan itself was simple, and on its own terms, genuinely brilliant. Let those 21 outsiders breed with the 23 indigenous survivors, fold the 2 bloodlines into one, and grow a single wild herd out of the combined population. It is quite literally the reason there are bison in Yellowstone today. This decision looked small at the time. It was not. For a while, everything about the plan looked like pure, uncomplicated success. The combined herd took hold in the Lamar Valley and began to grow, and the crisis seemed to pass. But that calm is exactly what hid the problem, because to understand what was actually riding inside those Montana and Texas animals, you have to know what ranchers across the West had quietly been experimenting with in the years just before Yellowstone ever came calling. During the beef shortages that followed the Great Slaughter, breeders had tried something that looked clever on paper. They crossed domestic cattle with bison, hoping to engineer a hardier animal that carried more meat. They even gave the result a name, Catalo. The experiment mostly failed. The hybrids never grew the way ranchers wanted, and most breeders eventually abandoned the idea. But abandoning a breeding program does not undo the breeding that already happened. Some of those crossbred animals and their descendants stayed quietly inside the herds, including the exact private herds the entire species would later be rebuilt from. Remember that detail. It is going to matter more than almost anything else in this story. There is a reason this story is still argued over today, and it very nearly took an even stranger turn before it got there. By the early 1900s, Michel Pablo's herd had outgrown the open range, and he offered to sell hundreds of his bison back to the United States government. He asked $250 a head. Washington sent an inspector to look over one of the largest bison herds on Earth and offered him $25. After negotiation, the number crept up to $75. Insulted, Pablo walked away from the United States entirely and sold his herd to the government of Canada instead. Starting in 1907, more than 700 of his animals were loaded onto trains in Ravalli, Montana, and shipped over 1,000 miles north into preserves in Alberta. Depending on which side of the border you were standing on, it was either an act of remarkable nerve or a catastrophic blunder by the United States. Either way, the seed stock of the species was now scattered across two countries, all of it descended from the same small mixed founder herds. What those founders started did not stay small. By the middle of the 20th century, the rebuilt herds had climbed back into the thousands, spread across parks, reserves, and tribal lands. At the National Bison Range in Montana, a white buffalo named Big Medicine, born in 1933, became a living symbol of that recovery. His pale coat made him almost unique and tribal. Members traveled to see him and pray in his presence. When he died in 1959, an animal that had once stood at the very edge of oblivion had become something close to sacred again. The species had been hauled back from nothing. What almost nobody understood yet was exactly what had been hauled back. By 2022, the Yellowstone bison were a conservation triumph measured in clean, round numbers. The herd had grown to roughly 5,400 animals, and for decades, researchers believed it carried two distinct ancestral lines, side by side. One traced directly back to the 23 indigenous survivors of central Yellowstone. The other traced back to the 21 animals hauled up from Montana and Texas in 1902. Geneticists had even given each line its own name, two separate clades preserved in the maternal DNA. For the first time, the family tree of the most famous bison herd in the world could supposedly be read straight from its genetic code, and what that code seemed to say was reassuring. Yellowstone was the gold standard, the single most genetically valuable bison population on the continent, precisely because so much of it traced back to those original wild survivors. Conservationists fenced the herd off from any contact with cattle and guarded it like treasure, because the entire point of the last 100 years had been to protect what everyone agreed was the last truly pure bison genome left on Earth. That assumption is exactly what a geneticist named James Derr set out to confirm. If a story like this, where the real history quietly turns out to be stranger than the official version, is the kind of thing you want more of, take a second to subscribe. This channel exists to dig up exactly these stories from America's wild places, and this next part is the entire reason this video got made. By the spring of 2022, the test was finally ready to run. Derr had already spent more than 20 years at Texas A&M University studying bison DNA, and his team, including a doctoral student named Sam Stroop and a collaborator named Brian Davis, set out to do something nobody had attempted at this scale. They sequenced full genomes from bison representing every major historical lineage and lined them up against the genomes of 1,842 domestic cattle, hunting for fragments, tiny stretches of DNA that simply did not belong. The genetic fingerprints of cattle ancestry hidden somewhere inside the bison code. They fully expected to find those fragments in the obvious herds, the ones with documented crossbreeding already in their history. And they did. What nobody expected was where else the fragments turned up. Every single bison genome the team analyzed carried identifiable regions of cattle DNA. Everyone. Not just the private commercial herds, where it was almost expected, but the national park herds too. As Stroop pointed out, the signature even showed up in herds that earlier genetic studies had specifically cleared, including Yellowstone and Elk Island in Canada, both long believed to be entirely free of any cattle ancestry. The most genetically intact bison on the planet, the animals fenced off and defended for over a century specifically to keep them pure, were carrying cattle DNA too. The amounts were small. One Yellowstone animal in the study came back at 0.24% cattle ancestry. Across introgressed bison more broadly, the levels ran somewhere between 0.56 and 1.8%, low enough that for 100 years the signal had hidden beneath the resolution of every test anyone had ever been able to run. But it was real, and it was everywhere, and it had been sitting quietly inside the genome of the very species America had spent a century trying to save. Derr later admitted he was extremely disappointed when he finally sat down and looked at the data. And here is the detail that puts those numbers into real perspective. That 0.24% of cattle DNA inside a Yellowstone bison is smaller than the share of Neanderthal DNA carried by most people of European or Asian descent, who typically run at around 2% or higher. In the strictest genetic sense, the purest wild bison alive on Earth is less mixed than you are. So how did cattle genes reach the one herd that was supposed to be completely untouchable? This is the detail that everyone had missed at the time, hiding in plain sight inside the rescue itself. The contamination did not come from any failure to protect the bison. It came from the very act of saving it. Those 18 cows from Montana and 3 bulls from Texas the outsiders shipped in to rescue Yellowstone in 1902 came from the same private herds that had spent years quietly running Catallo experiments. As Derr put it plainly, the people responsible for saving the bison from extinction in the late 1800s are the very same people responsible for introducing cattle genetics into the species in the first place. They pulled it back from the edge with one hand and, without ever realizing it, quietly rewired its future with the other. His colleague Brian Davis framed it the same way. Those well-intentioned hybridization efforts left behind a complicated genetic legacy, and yet without those same private herds, it is entirely possible the bison would have vanished for good. The rescue and the contamination were, in the end, a single event simply witnessed 120 years apart. If those ranchers had only ever gathered wild calves and never once touched a cow, this would be a very different story. But the prairie does not deal in clean lines, and that single finding flipped an entire field on its head. For decades, bison conservation had organized itself around purity. Herds were ranked by it. Some were prized, others were quietly dismissed, all based on how clean their genome was assumed to be. Now the cleanest herd on the entire continent had cattle DNA in it, which meant the very thing everyone had spent 100 years measuring did not exist in the pure form anyone thought it did. The reaction inside the bison world was not quiet. As one manager of a large private herd described it, the entire industry had been thrown into turmoil over the question, with some breeders completely unbothered by the news and others almost obsessed with the purity of their own genetics, whether for conservation or simply for profit. But some scientists argued this had been the wrong lens from the very beginning. A geneticist named Oliver Ryder cautioned against judging these animals by purity at all, since purity is fundamentally a human idea, one that is hard to square with the messy way real species actually develop in the wild. Brian Davis made the same point from a different angle. Hybridization, the blending of separate lineages, is a normal engine of evolution, woven through the history of countless species and not some modern accident anyone needs to be ashamed of. Seen that way, what the test exposed inside the bison was never contamination. It was ancestry. A genetic record of exactly how the species clawed its way through the narrowest moment of its existence, written permanently into every animal that carries it. The real question was never how pure these bison are. It was what the discovery actually sets free. For 100 years, conservationists poured enormous time and money into keeping bison herds isolated from one another, afraid that mixing them would spoil some pure ideal. If that ideal was never quite real to begin with, then a lot of those walls can finally come down, and herds once kept rigidly apart can be combined into healthier, more genetically diverse populations, which happens to be exactly what a battered bottleneck species needs most. You can already see that shift happening on the ground. Across the country, bison are returning to native lands at a scale that has not been seen in well over a century. In 2024, federal and Montana officials agreed to shorten the quarantine period for bull bison, leaving Yellowstone from roughly a year and a half down to about 300 days, redirecting more animals toward tribal nations instead of toward slaughter. In early 2026, the largest single bison transfer ever recorded sent 213 animals to the Fort Peck Reservation, where the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes now manage hundreds of buffalo across tens of thousands of acres of restored grassland. One tribal leader described the buffalo's return simply as a journey of healing for the land and for the people both. That phrase is not decoration. For the tribes of the Great Plains, the buffalo had always been far more than an animal. Food, shelter, tool, and ceremony all at once, the center of a way of life the slaughter had been specifically built to destroy. Bringing the herds home is, for many nations, the same act as bringing home a piece of themselves. The Intertribal Buffalo Council now coordinates exactly this kind of work across dozens of member tribes, treating every single transfer as restoration in far more than the ecological sense. The scale of that comeback is genuinely hard to overstate. Since 2020, conservation partnerships have returned more than 2,300 buffalo to tribal nations across the country. One organization alone, American Prairie, has relocated over 500 bison to tribes and conservation herds, while assembling a reserve of well over 100,000 acres of Montana grassland. And for the first time in a generation, Yellowstone rewrote its own rules, walking away from a long-standing political cap of 3,000 animals in favor of a target that now lets the herd range between roughly 3,500 and 6,000. A population that was once small enough to count on two hands is now managed in the thousands and deliberately allowed to keep growing. Inside Yellowstone itself, something quietly fitting has happened. The two ancestral lines scientists tracked as separate for so long, the indigenous survivors and the Montana newcomers, have simply merged. Kept distinct in the record books for 120 years, they now move and breed across the park as a single unified herd. Which brings us back to exactly where we started. The purest wild bison on Earth, the crown jewel, 99.7% untouched. That claim was true and false at the exact same time, and the narrow gap between the two holds the entire history of the species inside it. The trace of cattle, DNA inside a Yellowstone bison, reads less like a stain on the story and more like a fingerprint left behind by the rescue itself. Proof that a few hundred animals and a handful of stubborn, unrecognized people dragged an entire species back from the edge of nothing, and that the saving left a mark that never quite washed out. 23 survivors, 21 outsiders, one genome that still remembers all of it. If you want more stories where the real science quietly overturns everything we thought we already knew about America's wild places, let me know down in the comments and stay with this channel, because there are a lot more of these waiting to be told. I'm Graham Whitmore. Thanks for watching.